Hi, everybody. This is college Sunday school class for May 17th. May 17th. I should look on my sheet here, 17th. So once again, it's just me and Christy. So we did enjoy having Annie with us last week. That was fun. So this week, we're in Luke chapter 4 again. And this is the famous passage where Jesus goes to the synagogue and reads quotes from Isaiah 61. So a million different ways, not a million, a lot of different ways to go with this. But well, I'm just going to talk about two things. He seems to be announcing the year of release or Jubilee. And then there's this phrase that is in Luke that's not in the Isaiah 61 that I have. And I've come up with at least 6 different possibilities for that, reading commentaries and stuff. And I'm not going through all that. I think what we'll do is I'll just maybe say a couple of words about it and then go right to Isaiah, where this quote comes from, and think about how that might have been included in what Jesus read. All right, well, let's read it. So here it is with the highlighted portions. So in red here, Jesus' words in red. And you can see I've got it underlined, this idea of release to the captives in bold, underlined, and recover of sight to the blind. So those are the two things that we'll spend our time thinking about for this lesson. All right, so here we're going to read it. Verse 13, this is in Luke 4. When the devil had finished every temptation, he left him until an opportune time. So this is right at the end of the 3 temptations. So remember, the temptations came right after the genealogy, where Luke connects Jesus and his birth all the way back to creation, to God, Adam and God. And then right before that is the story of the baptism. And so I've got that marked here on the map. You can see he was being baptized somewhere around here. I've got this, see the Bethany east of the Jordan. And now Jesus is back home. You can see where Nazareth is, some 80 miles or so to the north. From Judea across Samaria and into Galilee. So that's where we are. It says in verse 14, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. That's really important for Luke to communicate to us. Remember, the power of the Spirit came upon him. Sorry, not the power. The Spirit descended upon him like a dove. This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. And then the Spirit is leading Jesus. There's a little bookmark there on the temptations about the Spirit leads him. The Spirit. It's important here that we recognize Jesus being led about by the power of the Spirit. News about him spread through all the surrounding district, and he began teaching in their synagogues, and was praised by all. So the image here is Jesus is moving about to the synagogues, and he's teaching Torah and prophets and writings to the people in the synagogues. He's well recognized. You'll notice here in just a minute, they're all like, man, he speaks so well about his Bible, and they know there's something going on. So Luke is now setting us up for one of these times that Jesus is at the synagogue. And it's important in the book of Luke here, I think, it's important to recognize that this represents for us in the Gospel of Luke the moment where Jesus introduces himself to the world. This is his coming out event right here at the synagogue. So he began teaching, it says, praised by all. He came to Nazareth, so you can see that on the map on the right over here. where he had been brought up. That's hometown. Nazareth is literally Stickville, which is what Natzer means in the Aramaic and Hebrew, a stick or a branch. So he's from Sticktown. Nazareth is a podunk place. Nobody, you remember the phrase, what good can come out of Nazareth? Okay, so this is where he was brought up, and as was his custom. It's interesting because when we get to the ministry of Paul in the book of Acts, this kind of thing reoccurs. This is what Paul does. He's going about, this was his custom. He goes into the synagogues, and he reads from the scripture to the people there. He entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. The book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, was handed to him. Okay, so this word book means something different to a modern reader. So there were no books. They didn't have a Bible like this. This was, in all likelihood, a scroll. And if the scroll here of Isaiah is, if we're to take from what this scroll is from antiquity and what these scrolls were, there was a scroll of Isaiah found, one of the full, complete scrolls found, the Dead Sea Scrolls, back in the mid-1900s, that is essentially a copy of the Masoretic text, our Old Testament Bible of Isaiah, that dates 1,000 years earlier than the oldest copy we have. It's one of the things. It's one of those things where, an archaeological find is like, oh my word, we are reading God's word kind of thing. Amazing archaeological find, and it was in a scroll. And when they roll the scroll out, I don't know how they did this, but Christy gave me a book about this whole Dead Sea Scroll thing, and I'm fascinated reading about all the scrolls they find and the fragments and how they try to put the pieces together. It's fascinating. But this one is like a complete copy, and it's I forget the dimensions. It's about 25 feet long, if I remember correctly. So when they hand Jesus this scroll, it's almost certain that if they were in a Jewish synagogue, that whoever would be reading from the scroll would be reading Hebrew. Almost certainly, he'd be reading Hebrew at the synagogue. So he would have rolled this scroll out, and probably there was no indication of chapters and verses on the scroll. It's just text written, and none of the text would have vowels. They wouldn't have point vowels like the Masoretes put in, like in 400 AD, to help with pronunciation. He would have to know how to speak the Hebrew. All indications are here Jesus was a Hebrew scholar. He knew. So in order for him to find the place where he wanted to read, he would have had to have spent some time in that scroll. So that's kind of lost in the reading here. I say, turn to Isaiah 61, and we all go, yeah. But it's a different phenomenon if you roll this thing out, and now you got to find the place. It says there, he opened the book and found the place where it's written. In our Bible, this is in Isaiah 61. Okay, and he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. So we're going to talk about that again just for a little bit, because we did this a couple weeks ago. This one on whom the Spirit of the Lord is, that's one of those phrases in the book of Isaiah that connects the poems, the Messianic poems. The Spirit of God is upon me. Because he anointed me, that's the Hebrew, don't do that. Because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives. So that is an important phrase that we're going to spend time with. And secondly, recovery of sight to the blind. We spend time with that one. To set free those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. This would be a direct reference to the year of Jubilee, which we're going to talk about again with this release to the captives phenomenon. Okay, then it says he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. So this is a moment of the dramatic. So I just try to imagine, Bart reading, he gets up to preach and we're used to him, reading and then expounding on that, he's talking and stuff. But now Jesus stands up and he reads and he just rolls the thing back up. Not a word, hands it to the attendant, walks over, sits down. And everybody's going. So a genius. I mean, he has their attention. Now they're watching carefully. It says, the eyes of all the synagogue were fixed on him. So I just imagine this moment of silence. Jesus is sitting there, and they're all just watching him. And so it doesn't say he stood up. It does say he began to say to them. So what the next words out of his mouth are, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Now, that we say, okay, Jesus has fulfilled the Old Testament promise of the coming Messiah. Got it. But for him to say those words to these people would have had a lot more impact. To them, what they're hearing him say, I think, is he has just announced that he is the coming Messianic King who is going to restore all things, to bring about the year of Jubilee, as was promised in the prophets. So for them, the year of Jubilee is significant, and I'm going to show you why. I know you know, Chris, but we're going to look at that one more time. Okay, so there's the passage. It ends here. They were all speaking well of him at first, I suppose, wondering at his gracious words that were falling from his lips. They were saying, is this not Joseph's son? It's like the murmuring, I remember him when he was like 10 years old, running around with his daddy, making woodwork stuff. Isn't that Joseph's boy? That did not sit well with Jesus. To him, this was their rejection. Because right after this, he brings up the example of the widow as their path and Naaman the leper. And then they want to stone him, because what he says there is basically, you reject me, I'm going to get the Gentiles. So he compares himself there to Elijah and Elisha, the prophets, in the story right after that. Okay, so there's all the introduction, so let's just talk some details. So this next slide is very busy, I know. So I wanted you to see them side by side. So on the left-hand column here, so I've got this labeled Our Old Testament, the Masoretic Text. This is my Bible here, my Old Testament, and here's Luke 4 right next to it. And what I did was I copied the verses out of Isaiah 61 on the left column, and I copied the verses out of Luke 4 on the right one. And then I spent 2 days working through all of the various words and differences. And so that is just absolutely rich and fascinating, and we're not going to do all that. But here's some of the results stuff here that you can see. I've got various Hebrew and Greek words here labeled for you to look at, should you care to do so. We're going to focus on 2 spots. All right, so first, the big green boxes here. To proclaim liberty or release to the captives in Isaiah 61, and the phrase in Luke's gospel, to proclaim release to the captives. The Hebrew word here, we're going to learn a Hebrew word, is pronounced doror. It means release. It's often used in the context of the release of slaves. Slavery is not a thing that most of us deal with on a day-to-day basis. but it is real in the world we live in, and it was particularly real in the world they lived in, both when Isaiah's words were written and in Jesus' day, because a significant portion of the population was living in slavery. And it could have been slavery because they are, the sense of they lived in slavery because they were conquered by a nation. But what's true a lot of times, we'll see in Leviticus, is the slavery is caused by debt that they incurred. People run out of money. They end up selling themselves to people who do have things. The crop didn't work that year. They got to sell their land. And so this is very near to them. They hear release, and they think, all my debts are paid. I'm back in good standing. I'm back on my own property, that kind of thing. Or they may think, I am no longer under the oppression of the Romans. They were probably processing it that way. It's interesting, the Greek word, you see the big green block on the Greek word? Aphesis, I don't know if I'm saying that right, can be translated pardon or forgiveness. So this idea, there's a tie between being released as a slave. It's almost as though, and being pardoned, that makes good sense, or to be forgiven. So those concepts are all tied together here. All right, so that's the first one we're going to do. This idea of doror, or aphesis, the release. And the second one is going to be the recovery of the sight to the blind. Here, you notice that in Luke it has recovery of sight to the blind. Do you see on the left-hand side what I have there? It's not there in Isaiah 61. And you can see there are some other issues between these two. And this is what I meant by saying there's a whole bunch of different possibilities for this. I will say this phrase right here, recovery of sight to the blind, is in the Septuagint of Isaiah 61. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So certainly there's a possibility that there's a Hebrew text behind the Septuagint that had this phrase in it, that the Septuagint picked up on. I think that's probably likely. But the other thing is Luke, of course, had a copy of the Septuagint. It's unlikely that Jesus was reading from the Septuagint. But that doesn't mean that Jesus here couldn't have said something about recovery of sight to the blind in his quote. There's evidence in other quotations from the New Testament that come out of one passage, but there'll be some inserts from other passages in those things. I like to think, and you can just make up your own mind. I like to think that Jesus said this as a way of demonstrating his real scholarly knowledge of the book of Isaiah. So I'm going to back that up. So I'm going to show you some passages at the end of this where this idea of this person that the Spirit of the Lord is upon, the Messianic King, and the idea that the blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the dumb speak, all these concepts are really heavy in the poetry of Isaiah. So I like to think that Jesus may have inserted this as a way of demonstrating, when preachers are talking sometimes, they're bringing up verses from different places while they're reading and they're talking. So Jesus is not required to read verbatim a quotation from Isaiah. Now, he may have. I think that's possible that there was a text behind this. But there's another possibility. Jesus was bringing in other really important concepts about the Messianic kingdom in his quotation of Isaiah. Okay, that's enough of that. We're just going to read some passages about recovery of sight to the blind, but I wanted you to see that here in the comparison. If any of you guys are interested, some of you have asked me for other slides in past weeks, but I have a much more extensive slide set with a lot more information on it. If you want it, just send me a text or an email or whatever. Give me a call. I'm happy to send you a copy of that. Okay, enough. All right, so there's the Isaiah 61, Luke 4 thing. All right, so let's talk about this idea of what did it really... So when Jesus quoted this, I'm the one who's going to proclaim liberty to the captives. How would that have sit? How would that have impacted the hearers? Okay, so here is a slide from a couple weeks ago where we went from poem to poem to poem in Isaiah, linking concepts. So remember we talked about the last days, Ba'aharit Hayamim, Carmen's favorite phrase in the Hebrew Bible. At least she smiles when I ask her to say it. And then walking in the light of the Lord and the people seeing a great light. The poems of Isaiah 2 and 9 are connected. The king is sitting on the throne of David in chapter 9. Chapter 11, this is the one who has the Spirit of the Lord upon him, and he's from Jesse. That's David. And then the Spirit of the Lord is upon him in Isaiah 42. And this is the one who is a light to the nations, bringing up the light imagery again. And he's going to bring out the prisoners, release the prisoners here in Isaiah 42. And so when you get to Isaiah 61, this one who has the Spirit of the Lord upon him brings liberty or doror to the captives. There it is again from 42. And freedom to the prisoners, which is what we just quoted from Luke. Okay, so for Jesus to read from Isaiah 61 is in essence tying the whole book of Isaiah together. Okay, so that's the first thing here. All right, but of course there's more to this idea of release. So this idea of a year of release, this Jubilee year, as far as I know, never happened. I've read through, I've looked, searched in there. There's some stuff in Nehemiah that indicates maybe some kind of something, but this idea that they just took the whole year, I can't find any real evidence of that in the Bible. Doesn't mean they weren't instructed to do it. So let's talk about that for just a minute. Okay, so all this stuff is in Leviticus 25. So I'm on slide now. Which one am I on, Chris? Slide number 5. So, okay, so in Leviticus 25 it says, 6 years you shall sow in your field, 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crop. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest. Now, if you read the end of the book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, it looks like the author of Chronicles is saying that this is one of the reasons they were taken to Babylon. They did not behave as God's covenant people, and one of those covenants was the land's going to have its rest. And it's almost like the time they spent in Babylon was, in the language of the chronicler there, a way of giving the land its rest because they hadn't. So the people, the Jewish people really understood that this was part of their national identity kind of thing. This is why God sent the nation into the Babylonian captivity. At least part of the reason, because this part of the covenant was not kept. It's a big deal. The next one, Leviticus 25:8 says, you're also now to count off seven Sabbaths of years for yourself. 7 times 7 years. So every 7th year, whole year. And then you go 7 times 7 year, and thus it says you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim, there's the word, the Hebrew word, a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Now, okay, so what do you mean when you say a release, a year of jubilee? Is this the same thing as taking a whole year off. It's not. Because this year, this additional year here, the year of release here, the Jubilee, is something different. So I would encourage you, just take 6 minutes and read through the rest of Leviticus 25. I picked out a couple here so you can see how this is. When Jesus stands up and he says, Isaiah promised the year of Jubilee, when all the prisoners, the great Messianic King is going to make this happen and everybody gets released. This is the kind of thing that's in their head. Okay, so here are a couple to illustrate it. Leviticus 25, if a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor, he has to sell part of his property. And I skipped some verses here. But if he has not found sufficient means to get it back for himself, at the Jubilee it shall revert, that he may return. So you see what he's saying here. This is, you were in slavery, you had to sell your property, not yours anymore. Okay. Once you pay it back, but you can't. So at the year of Jubilee, what happens? All those debts, they just get erased. Just erase all that debt and everything goes back to the original. That's what they're hearing when he says the release. Here's the second one, verse 39 here. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor that he sells himself to you. Verse 40, he shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. And then, back to his family. So, this is the other idea. So I can't afford it, so you've got my property, but I can't do anything, so now I'm your slave. So then what happens? Year of Jubilee, all goes back. Everybody is elevated back to their original great whatever property ownership. And so you can imagine how disruptive this would be to any society, and how this would impact a person's thinking. If you thought this was going to happen and you lost everything that you owned, or you were somehow in captivity, slavery kind of thing, then this would be something that created a kind of hope for you just to live another day in the hope of this year of Jubilee. So when Isaiah takes this concept of release to the captives and he plugs in the Messianic King, it becomes a prophetic hope for the future, that the king's going to come and there's going to be a control, alt, delete, a resetting. All the captives are free. All the debts are paid, kind of thing. So we think about release of captives. I'm not sure, maybe for some of you guys, I don't know. But for me, it doesn't hold the punch that it would have when these people heard Jesus say it. This is what they were processing, the year of Jubilee. Okay, now here you can see on my Bible Gateway search, I searched for feast because this idea of the year of release, or the Doror and the year of Jubilee, this is how Jesus announces himself. This is how he comes on the scene. And these guys would be processing the year of release according to this verbiage out of Leviticus, and then how Isaiah picks up on it. But this idea of the release and the year of Jubilee is actually tied to the way these people lived,
the rhythms of their life,
or the way they wanted to live, we should say, maybe. And so the way they lived, the way they, from week to week, from year to year, this stuff is, the year of release it's almost like it's always on their mind. So I wanted to spend just a couple minutes reviewing this. You could go all over the New Testament. Obviously, feasts are mentioned. Some of these are wedding feasts, but the major feast and the pilgrimage feast that the Jewish people made were part of how they lived. And I wanted to spend just a minute again reviewing how that rhythm of living would have. These people are all sitting in the synagogue, listening to Jesus talk about he's fulfilling this promise that Isaiah made. This is tied up in how they actually live from week to week, from year to year. So I wanted to show you that one more time, and then we'll do the prisoners and we'll be done. Okay, so now I'm on slide 7. As Christy said, this is their rhythms of life. So in Exodus 20, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day it is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you will do no work, you or your sons or daughters, your male or your female servant, stable cattle, whoever stays with you. Verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So this is rhythm number 1. This is how we live. Jews would have been known in their culture. Wherever they lived, they would have been known. They don't work on the 7th day. That was not common. We live in a world that's like Monday to Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday is the weekend. This is not how it's not how people lived. So they would have been known. It was the rhythm of their life every 7th day. Question. What was the purpose of this rhythm according to Exodus 20? Why? Why practice this?
It was to remember creation and the seventh day. The Lord rested to think of Him.
Yeah, I think absolutely. The 7th day rest is supposed to make the person resting go, my busyness is not going to ultimately provide for me. I'm supposed to think about a God who cares for me. I'm supposed to think about a God who created the world. And I think I'm supposed to think about a God who's going to recreate the world. This is what's supposed to happen in that rhythm. I don't think, well, anyway, that's rhythm number 1. Every week, every 7th day. Now, here, this rhythm is tied to creation. And you'll remember this from before, I think, on slide number 8. We did this when we were in the Gospel of John. This idea of the 7th day rest and the sevens, man, you can just really spend a lot of time with this. So the first 2 verses of the Bible, 7 words, 14 words. As the story comes to its end, for the 6-day creation story in Genesis 2, he says, verse 2, by the 7th day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Here is that verse in Hebrew. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. It's 14 words. So there's something going on here with the rhythms of life and the rhythms of 7. And you heard that whenever I was reading about the year release as well. So let's go back and look at that one more time. Here it was before. This is on slide number 5, Chris. Leviticus 25. Yeah? So verse 9, this is the 7th year. 6 years you sow, but on the 7th year, then just couple verses later, you're to count off 7 Sabbaths for yourselves, 7 times 7. So the rhythm of life becomes every 7 days, every 7 years, every 49 years. This is, so when he says a release, this is, I mean, it doesn't hit me. Maybe it does other people, but it doesn't hit me, I don't think, like it would have hit them to hear him say what he did about the year of release. Okay. So, wait, last one here. I'm back on slide 7, Chris. So every 7 days, right? So rhythms of life. So here's another rhythm they had. Let me show it to you in the New Testament so you can see it with your own eyes. On slide number 6, Chris, go back one more. The first reference there at the top of my box, Luke 2:41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. So every 7 days, every 7 years, every 49 years, this was the rhythm of the national identity. And then here, they're actually making a pilgrimage. And as it turns out, they were told to do this 3 times a year. So next slide, slide number 7. Exodus 23, under B there, Chris. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord. Deuteronomy 16 tells us specifically what feast they were to do this for. 3 times, all the males appear before the Lord in the place which he chooses at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that's the 7 days after the Passover event. And then at the Feast of Weeks, that's Pentecost. That would be why there were so many people in Jerusalem when the Spirit came on the first people at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Why was everybody packed in there? And this is because this is what they did. National identity, thousands of people 3 times a year descend upon this place. It was their rhythm of life. It's what they did. And then the third one at the Feast of Booths. So just remember that Feast of Booths thing. In the last slide, I'm going to read from Zechariah chapter 14. Because the prophets, not just Isaiah, but other prophets, are thinking about this rhythm of life and the 7s and the journeys and the pilgrimages, and they're using that language to tell us about everything. All right. Okay. So here are the 3 times of year. I'm on slide number 9. The 3 times of year. Notice all the 7 stuff. So I've got these split up here with the 3 journeys, A, B, and C. So the first set here, A, a 14th day. So look at the wording out of Leviticus 23. In the first month, on the 14th day at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. Jesus and what he did on the cross is specifically tied to this event. I mean, he shows up at Passover. And that's when he is murdered on the cross. So it means something to us folks here. It means something to me in thinking about what Jesus has done, Passover. It's on the 14th day of the first month. Then on the 15th day, there's to be a feast of unleavened bread. For how long? 7 days. Okay. Then the second journey time, the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. It says in Leviticus 23:15, you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, there will be 7 complete Sabbaths. You shall count 50 days to the day. You shall bring in from your dwelling place a wave offering as a first fruits to the Lord. So the second journey is just 7 weeks later. And then the third one, this one is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Booths, the Sukkot. This is said to be on the 10th of the 7th month and the 15th of the 7th month. Feast of Booths for 7 days. So Leviticus 23, on exactly the 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Verse 34, speak to the sons of Israel on the 15th of this 7th month is the Feast of Booths for how long? 7 days. Okay, so the rhythms are all, it doesn't surprise me. The more I read this stuff, the more I think, all those 7 lists of sevens, and Christy mentioned one to me out of Revelation yesterday. Which one was that? And he says that in Revelation.
It's said 7 times.
7 times. So this stuff, John for sure was really impacted by this, the rhythm of sevens, everything. So don't want to get too weird. I've heard some people get really weird about this, but there's no doubt that this was a rhythm of life for these people. Now, Christy also gave me, just so you guys can see it, slide number 10. This is out of her Bible, and you can see from left, you can't read this well because it's so small, I'm sure, if you guys are looking at it. But you can print it off if you want, and then you'll have it if you don't have one of these in your Bible. And it ties Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets. This is Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the Feast of Booths. And so these are the 7 major festivals. First month, Nisan, and the 7th month, Tishri. And you can see the order. And there's all kinds of references here. And you can just look at these references and spend, I don't know, the next 3 hours just reading this stuff. It is so great. But anyway, this is stuff, it's not natural for me to think like this. Maybe it should be, but I don't think in terms of Yom Kippur, and I guess I do more now than I used to, but this was the context.
What was embedded in their culture? It's like us having 4th of July, Memorial Day, and all of that. It's just what the whole culture does, but it's also embedded in their religion too. So it makes it easier when the whole society's doing all of this.
Yeah. And then it's within this context that Jesus does what he does. So, I think it's important to think about these and sort of get this kind of straight in our heads. This is a graph that I really like that shows the 3 journeys and has the 7 vessels on the calendar, circular calendar. You can see the March-April time is Passover. And then look at where we are right now. Here's the May-June time, the month of Sivan. This would be Pentecost. So this is coming up. I put the date in there. See it? That's next week. So not this Thursday, but next Thursday. And it's the celebration for the Jewish people. This was when Moses went up on Mount Sinai. This happens to be where the Spirit came at Pentecost. And so all those things are tied together. And it's coming up. So Christy and I are going to talk about it next week on May the 28th. We're going to read Exodus 20 together and think about the coming of the Spirit to help us be people who obey the Lord and are controlled by his Spirit. And then you can see here the other 3, Rosh Hashanah, and they're all based on 7s. It's the 1st month and the 7th month and the 7 days. Y'all read all that. It's just, I think as I get older, I'll get more used to thinking about my faith, I hope, in terms of these rhythms of 7 and what that means for who Jesus is. Certainly the way the New Testament authors put these things, put Jesus and what he did in the context of these feasts. And Chris, you want to add something to that? Or? Okay. All right, last thing then is I want to, so let's go back to the slide. Well, no, I don't have to go back to it. So remember, in the quote that Jesus makes there in Isaiah 61, in our Bible, it doesn't have the phrase, the eyes of the blind are opened, or how is it worded? Go back and look at that. That was in the first slide, second slide. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives. So now I think, if I just highlight that for you, the doror, the release to the captives. So I think I'm starting to hear a little bit more about the weightiness of that phrase. Yeah, the release. And so here's the last one. So this is all tied up in the rhythm of living and their hope. So Isaiah has written this to say, y'all, there's one coming on whom the Spirit of the Lord is, and release for all is coming. It's on the way. And then Jesus says, I'm the one. That's what he did in the synagogue. I'm the one. And then this idea of recovery of sight to the blind is also very heavily emphasized in the book of Isaiah. There's another one I mentioned. I didn't put it in the presentation, but in Matthew, I think it's Matthew 11, Chris, where John the Baptist is in prison. And he sends his disciples over. He says to Jesus, you want to read it for us there? It'd be great.
Yeah. Jesus answered him, saying, well, John the Baptist said to him, are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else? And Jesus answered and said to them, go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them.
So you can hear the poor and the gospel and the blind recurring. And that, does it have there in your Bible where that's a quote from?
I've got things written on the side of mine. Isaiah 35, 5, and Isaiah 61, 1.
Okay, so yeah, so this is what I was saying before. Jesus is, he's mixing different places from the Old Testament to tell John that he's the one. Because John would have known about these places. So I think it would be fun just to read a couple of them.
Okay, which ones?
Okay, so go ahead. You were going to say
I just think, personally, I think in the Luke 4, when he's reading from the scroll, I think he's reading from the scroll because that's what they did in the synagogue. And to me, they would have said, well, he's getting that mixed up. But if he's reading directly from it, all the people hearing, it would have been pure from the scripture. And that's why they were there that day, when they stand up to read. And it's, to me, more evidence that that's when he sits down and says,
yeah.
Because here he's just answering a question.
Yeah, that's a great point.
He's just answering a question, they said, and he's just pulling stuff from different scripture that John would have known.
Yeah.
John would have known immediately all those places he was talking about. Yeah. So it was a giving John the answer to his questions from multiple sources in the Bible.
Yeah.
But because he's reading Torah in the synagogue, and that was there was someone who always stood up to read. That was their job. Yeah. It was weightier. Yeah. It wasn't a debate in a sense.
Yeah. It's what it says.
Right. But that's just my when I'm picturing it in my mind. So anyway. Okay, what are the ones you want to read?
Okay, so I've got them in the presentation.
Okay.
The one that you just said from Isaiah 35 is on the next slide. So I'm just going to read 3 slides without comment. There's 3 slides here without comment to finish today. And then I'm going to ask Chris if she'd like to help me think about this. Okay, so you can go all over the New Testament and find places where Paul and the others are talking about this hope that they have in what Christ is going to do. And those verses, just like the ones that you read when Jesus is talking to John the Baptist, I mean, one of the reasons John was I think one of the reasons that John was, having some doubts is because he had this hope in mind. The release of the prisoners, the year of Jubilee. I mean, this is what he's got.
And John was in prison, so
And
things
he
weren't
was
looking
he
up
was
for
in
him.
jail. Yeah, right. Okay, so I don't think what we find in the New Testament is a presentation of Jesus that says that's the end of it. So here's an example of that in Peter's second sermon in the book of Acts in chapter 3. He says in verse, so I'm just going to read it now. And then I'm going to read some Isaiah passages in Zechariah. And I've got in bold red the pieces that I think would have been extremely familiar in the prophetic hope concepts that were influencing the way people thought about the coming Messiah. Okay, so here's Peter's sermon, second sermon in the book of Acts. But the things which God announced beforehand by the mouth of all the prophets, that his Christ would suffer, he has thus fulfilled. Therefore, repent and return, so that your sins may be wiped away, in order that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that he may send Jesus, the Christ appointed for you, whom heaven must receive until the period of restoration of all things, about which God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from ancient time. Isaiah 32. Behold, a king will reign righteously, and princes will rule justly. Each will be like a refuge from the wind and a shelter from the storm, like streams of water in a dry country, like the shade of a huge rock in a parched land. Then the eyes of those who see will not be blinded, and the ears of those who hear will listen. The mind of the hasty will discern the truth, and the tongue of the stammerers will hasten to speak clearly. 3 chapters later, the wilderness and the desert will be glad, and the Arabah will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will blossom profusely and rejoice with rejoicing and shout of joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Encourage the exhausted and strengthen the feeble. Say to those with anxious heart, take courage, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. The recompense of God will come, but he will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. The scorched land will become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals, its resting place, grass becomes reeds and rushes. A highway will be there, a roadway. It will be called the highway of holiness. The unclean will not travel on it, but it will be for him who walks that way. And fools will not wander on it. No lion will be there, nor will any vicious beast go up on it. These will not be found there, but the redeemed will walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion, with everlasting joy upon their heads. they will find gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. And then, last from the book of Zechariah, you see the Feast of Booths in the book of Zechariah. Now, this is a long one, so I truncated, but I put dots where I truncated them. So just read this, and that'll be it. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations. In that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. Then the Lord, my God, will come, and all the holy ones with him. In that day there will be no light, for it will be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night. But it will come about that at evening there will be light. And in that day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and the other half toward the western sea. And it will be in summer as well as in winter. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day, the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. All the land will be changed into a plain, but Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site. People will live in it. There will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security. Now this will be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongue will rot in their mouth. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. In that day, there will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, Holy to the Lord. Okay, so I left that without comment. That would be fun just to talk about those passages for a long time. But I just wanted you guys to see some more of this this prophetic language. This language would be tied up in what they heard Jesus. I think this would all be tied up in what they heard Jesus say when he sat down after reading that Isaiah 61 thing, and he says, "Today's the day."
Something struck me when you read Acts 3, and it said the mouths of all the prophets, that God announced these things from the mouths of all the prophets. And when in Luke 4:22, after Jesus said in 21, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing," it says in 22, "And all were speaking well of him and wondering at the gracious words that were falling from his lips." And they were saying, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" And it makes me think they're thinking, well, he's speaking like a prophet.
Oh, yeah.
That ties him. Because when you read it the first time we read out loud, I thought, that's odd to say gracious words falling from his lips.
Yeah.
But in my margin, it also said it could also mean proceeding out of his mouth. So it's that same language.
Yeah.
So they're thinking, well, he's speaking like a prophet. But his dad's a carpenter.
Yeah.
He's a son of a carpenter.
Yeah.
And so those two weren't reconciling when they heard him do all of this, say all these things.
Yeah, that makes good sense too with where he goes next, because they had their words were basically words of rejection for him. And so he, like a minute ago when I said, well, then he says, okay, well, I'm going to the Gentiles. That's the widow, but that's the stories of Elijah and Elisha, arguably the two of the most famous prophets in all of the Old Testament. So
in verse 24, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his hometown."
so he basically just calls himself straight up a prophet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, but he's also making something a bigger claim than the prophetic claim. He's saying here, you know all that stuff you guys are hoping for, it's all found in me. So how would you answer the question, Chris, of somebody who says, well, that's not the way the world is? All that stuff about there's no more suffering and no more, how would you answer that question? I'm setting her up to talk about it. I know. I mean, did he bring the year of release?
Yes, and it's to come.
Yeah, this is something that,
Because we do live in freedom and liberty, but yet we're still
in prison.
in prison.
Yeah. Yep.
So it's a present and future happening.
Things that make you go.
Let you ponder on it for the rest of your life.
For the rest of your life, yeah. And just hope that the Spirit that our hearts are in such a condition that the Spirit can use us and make us into people of this kingdom where God is King, and go walk on the highway of holiness. All right. Y'all have a good week.